I want to take a break from the music stuff for just a moment and talk about something that I was quite surprised by. That first season of That 90s Show, I pretty much finished the whole thing in a day or two really comfortably, and I thought it was a good example of a revival of a show done right. I think what's important to begin this review is that no, I don't think it's better than the original. I think there is a really common misconception with viewers with these new shows trying to steal the thunder of the original. At least in streaming television, it's almost designed to shadow the original series and use that familiarity to springboard its own story. I say mainly streaming because video games had their own selling points. It either looks better, it's been localized. Usually movie remakes have their own sort of ego or statement they want to make with that original IP. Successful TV continuations, from what I've seen, is usually at first trying to be as seamless as possible. It's never trying to compete the original, just to be a companion piece, just to run on without any disruption. And I felt it was necessary more than ever to shed light on a faithful remake when the failed reboots just keep piling up and up. I just saw the first episode of Velma recently as well, and instead of being a quiet return of the character, they decided to just take a swing at the champ and actively try and erase the old property. But in exchange of meta humor aimed specifically at the people who cherish the old property, it was destined to be forgotten. I originally felt it was a bit of a cheap cop-out to rely on the existing property to get greenlit, but looking at that 90s show, I realized it's really hard to get that balance right between familiarity and freshness. The new generation of characters are all quite new to acting, most of them this being their first major television role. I think they all did quite well interpreting these characters, carving their own mark into the stories. This series in particular I was really worried about because we have a direct example of this being done wrong with one of the worst characters of any TV show in the last 20 years. There aren't any obvious slackers, but Sam Morello's as Nikki really flourishes. Kitty and Red returning are fantastic anchor points for the fans left unconvinced. While their personal arcs have mellowed out as they grow older, the chemistry between the two have blossomed their relationship to each other in a really natural and satisfying way. For example, I think it's a really natural progression to have Red let things slide in exchange for peace now that he's a bit older. In fact, Red being stuck in his heyday is more fitting than ever 20 years later now that he's older and he falls further behind. Deborah Jo Rupp steals every scene with her magnetic personality and remains far and away my favourite character. The return of the original cast were great, and while it felt faithful to those characters, it also was a dignified step down to these characters to let the new generation in. Even with the Steven Masterson situation, I thought it was handled quite well by failing to mention Hyde at all. Some fans were upset, but we all know that childhood friend that failed to launch, naturally he would have been left behind. Of course we would have loved more, but it proved these new characters can stand on their own. Much like the 1970s, the showrunners seem to have a good grip on the niche happenings of the 90s. They have a great way of sorting through the disingenuine fads in turn for the real and convincing crazes that 15-year-old kids at the time would be infatuated with. More important than ever in this decade, as it literally was the decade of fads and pop culture. Seeing the Foreman family struggle with the computer just rings really true to every household at the time. I personally never felt taken out of it, and I'm usually really cynical of things like that if things don't quite add up to the time period. I want to draw some attention to the set and art direction because it's actually genius the more I read into it what was actually left from the original series. The upstairs is almost identical, the original couch and armchair are now in the basement, and Kitty's hair remaining the same for 20 years actually makes so much sense. Seeing some of the negative reviews of this show, I see that people are complaining about how corny the show is, and of course the biggest detriment, the laugh track on the show. I am all for ditching the laugh track trend, but I think people are failing to remember what they actually are trying to recreate. The same people complaining about this probably remember fondly sitcoms of the time. Like, I don't think there's much more that the showrunners can do apart from shoot it in 4:3 and have people complain about the resolution and aspect ratio. This is a comment on the original show as well, because I feel like the first season really was carried by that live audience. There were also like these weird comments about it being too woke for the 90s, which is just a big question mark to me. If I had to write an angsty 90s female teen, of course I would just throw in some Riot Girl there. Like, I don't know what you expected. Did you want Red to start yelling homophobic slurs at Ozzy? I want to put a spoiler on my personal gripes with the show. There aren't that many, but they are story-based, so skip to the end for my final thoughts. So Jay being Michael and Jackie's son is a necessary evil, but it makes Point Place feel really empty. It's like a Star Wars style Catch-22. Everyone needs to know everyone and it just makes the world really small. I don't think Jay is a really complex character either. I feel like it was just an excuse to bring Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis back for a minor role. and them being the parents means that they can get it over easy and early. Speaking of the original cast, it is almost frustrating how well they get along on screen. I would love to see them stumble through adulthood together. Seeing those tinges of red shine through Eric is really lovely, and Donna struggling to call Kitty mum would be a great arc, but it's just dropped as soon as she leaves. Certain story plots like the rave and subsequent jokes about designer drugs feel a little unrealistic for characters that young. This would have been a great set piece for a later episode when they're growing up, but it feels really jarring Gwen talking about $40 pills keeping her up for days when we are just seeing them do the untapped keg bit a couple episodes before. I think this was pushed in there because the first season of that 70s show had that disco scene, but the characters in the original were 17, not 15. And those are two extremely different ages for writing. I think the little thing between Leia and Nate at the end of the season felt very unnecessary. I think the issues that she had with Jay were enough to end the season on. Something like Leia and Nate would be great for a season-long arc. Throwing it at the end felt very rushed and hollow. Ozzy felt underdeveloped, but I would say the same about Fez for a majority of the whole original series. But as I'm starting to realize, these are all very similar issues that I had with the original series at its start. I think as time goes on, this will be accepted as the original's younger sibling and will have a much better lifespan than that 80s show. Glenn Howerton needs a better manager, Jesus. To say that you prefer the original is not a profound statement, it's by design. The bar is to be accepted by fans, and I think this matches it with a little bit of promise. But at the end of the day, it's not up to me. It now has to run the gauntlet of Netflix executives refreshing Twitter to see how many days it trends, but I genuinely hope we get to see more of 1990s Wisconsin. If I were to give the original series an 8 out of 10, I would give this season a 7. But if I was to compare it to the first season of the original show, I would say they're pretty equal. I reckon you should give it a watch. I think it's some good stuff. I have a couple more things planned for you in the coming weeks, so stay tuned, I guess. I'll see you then.